part of free speech. So a variety of factors shape how people understand these social interactions: law, space, rights. We talk about campus, but we haven't talked about residential work and learning environments. What does it mean when this conversation is happening in a classroom versus on a public thoroughfare versus in a dorm situation? And identity is implicated in our understanding of speech rights. If students believe they must accept humiliating or degrading, threatening public speech, the law is working through free speech to normalize these interactions and the resultant subordination that comes from them. Now, we celebrate difficult cases when the First Amendment is used to protect the speech we hate, right? The speech we hate test. Nazi hate speech, Nazis marching through Skokie, KKK, cross-burning, Westboro Baptists. But considered another way, what we see is our law is protecting some groups and not others. And so we need to be having conversations across these group strategies, or across these group identities. One of the findings in my book is that people of non-target groups substantially underestimate the frequency of harassment for target groups. And what I hear this group saying at both the Arizona conference and here, I think, is that there are other groups on campus that are feeling marginalized. And so what we need to do is try to listen to each other. While we think of just speech, of racist hate speech and sexually dominating speech, doing the act of subordinating because they're undergirding these our violent past of slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, coverture, lawful marital rape, domestic violence, and so on. Instead of arguing about who is or isn't being allowed to speak, which is ironic and circular, I'm arguing that we need to take the time to listen and ask America to live up to the promise that it's made to white women and people of color long ago, but hasn't yet fulfilled. And I hope we spend some time today talking about how we can use practical, pedagogical, and educational tools that we all have at our disposal to do just that. And so, thank you very much.
Well, let me begin with a couple of preliminaries. First, I want to congratulate Paul Carrese and the new school, of which he is the founding leader, on their achievement in establishing the school and at hiring such a wonderful group of people in the administrative and faculty positions. I think you've set an example, you are setting an example for the entire country of promoting not only diversity of thought, which is very important, but also civility. What goes on within the school and under the school's auspices is absolutely exemplary. So, Paul, congratulations. Secondly, I want to thank Greg Lukianoff, because no one has done more than Greg and FIRE to advance the cause of freedom of speech on college campuses, and to do so in a non-partisan way, representing the basic rights to freedom of speech and more broadly academic freedom, quite irrespective of whether the person whose rights are violated or jeopardized happens to be on the right or on the left, happens to be religious or secular, Republican or Democrat, what have you. Again, what FIRE is doing is just exemplary and so important for the cause of academic freedom and freedom of speech. Well, I think we do have a crisis, and the crisis is described, I think, quite adequately in the title of today's meeting. It is a crisis of free speech, a crisis of intellectual diversity, and a crisis of civil dialogue on our campuses. Even before you heard Greg's presentation, you were probably aware of how the crisis is presenting itself in terms of free speech. People are shut down on campuses today. They're shut down based on the content of their speech. Very often, it's not even that the speech is harsh or provocative. It's the content of what's being argued. It's the ideas that are being asserted and defended that are held to be, by significant elements, sometimes powerful elements on the campus, beyond the pale, unworthy of being heard, worthy of being shut down and excluded, and even made the basis for punishment. So yes, we have a crisis of free speech. And a crisis of intellectual diversity. Look at the numbers and do the math. What are students hearing on our college campuses, whether they're in the Ivy League or in the great state universities, or really across the board, with the exception of some small, relatively small religious institutions? They're hearing pretty much a single message because there are so few faculty members who represent dissent from the prevailing moral or political or religious orthodoxy on campus. And that's bad because it undermines education. It's not just that it's unfair to the points of view that are so severely underrepresented. That's true, but that's not what fundamentally worries me. What fundamentally worries me is that we're not giving our students, whether they happen to be liberals or conservatives, Republicans or Democrats, secular, religious, an education. They're not getting an education because they're not hearing the engagement of competing viewpoints. They're not hearing the best that is to be said on the competing sides of important moral and political and cultural questions. So yes, a crisis there, one that we are puzzled, frankly. Even people of goodwill who recognize the crisis are puzzled about just how we can come to terms with it, just what we can do about it. And the crisis in civil dialogue. And this one is not simply to be written down to left-wing hegemony on college campuses, because we have incivility across the board. There's the incivility of the chant that Laura just referred to by, I think she said it was fraternity men.
Oh, it happened at Yale. Yale,
in front of a fraternity. Yeah, okay, I mean, there's a classic case of incivility, which doesn't seem to have a lot to do about politics, but it's certainly uncivil at the least. There's the inability of people across the spectrum, on campuses and beyond, to treat each other, much less to actually regard each other cognitively and affectively, as reasonable people of goodwill who happen to disagree with them about this, that, or the other issue. Here's another point on which I agree with Laura. We don't agree on a lot of things, but I think we agree on this. Listening is the key. Listening, not just hearing, by the way, not just tolerating what the other person is saying, thinking about something else perhaps while we're letting the person have his or her say, but actually listening, taking on board, considering that one actually might have something to learn, that one might be wrong if one's being challenged by an interlocutor, being willing to actually engage. And we see the incivility both reflected in and partially provoked by provocations by people who are brought onto campus deliberately as provocateurs, deliberately to provoke. Now, why is that happening? My own view is that it is largely to be explained by the sense of suffocation that students holding dissenting points of view experience on their campuses. They feel that they are in a bubble, that they live in an environment of groupthink where effectively it's impossible to express dissent or even to have alternative points of view considered. And so there are people who are prepared, usually for a pretty good fee, to come in and provide a service of causing an uproar, blowing things up, not only questioning the prevailing political orthodoxies, but doing so in the most incendiary possible way. We are blessed at Princeton, where I teach. We have our problems, but we are blessed to have a larger measure of intellectual diversity than one finds at most secular university campuses, or for that matter, most religious campuses. And we are blessed that on the whole, our campus as a whole is a free speech zone. I think that helps to explain why our students have not felt compelled to invite onto campus the most incendiary speakers to be provocateurs. They recognize and appreciate the fact that theirs is a campus in which it's possible publicly to dissent, that other people will listen to a competing point of view being presented, where there are, mirabile dictu, faculty members, and not just one. Many campuses have only one, or at least one out-of-the-closet conservative, but more than one, who actually defend points of view that are out of whack, out of line with the prevailing orthodoxy. There are many advantages to intellectual diversity and freedom of speech, and those advantages have to do mostly with enabling a university or other institution of higher learning to fulfill its mission. What's its mission? It seems to me it's basically threefold. Truth-seeking, seeking knowledge of the truth, that's number one. Transmitting knowledge of truth once it's securely obtained, although it can never be perfectly securely obtained. And anything, no matter how deeply we believe it on a college campus, should be open to critique and to challenge. So, seeking the truth, seeking knowledge, transmitting knowledge and the intellectual skills and information that are necessary so that students become truth seekers, lifelong truth seekers, and then the preservation of knowledge. Those seem to me to be the key factors. But at a time of crisis, which I agree with Rahm Emanuel is a terrible thing to waste, at a time of crisis, we should repair to our first principles. And the very first of the first principles is truth-seeking. And to have truth-seeking, you need your campus to be a free speech zone. There should be norms of civility, because civility is also necessary for the truth-seeking enterprise to go forward. But it's important that civility not be used as an excuse or rationalization for excluding points of view that challenge prevailing orthodoxies. And that's especially important once you have, for whatever reasons, whatever caused it, the kinds of ideological imbalances that we have on campuses today. I'll close by telling you what the best thing I've done and the best experiences I've had in my 32 and a half years of teaching, all at Princeton. I came straight out of graduate school and have been there ever since. Best thing I have done and the best experiences I have had have to do with teaching with my pal Cornel West. Paul kindly mentioned the statement that Cornel and I released almost a year ago in 2 days, March 14th. That statement was called it was called Truth-Seeking, Democracy, and Freedom of Thought and Expression. But behind that is a decade of work together, teaching together, traveling around the country together, especially the teaching. Being in a room with 18 bright, young undergraduates, working on some of the great texts of the great thinkers of history, beginning with Sophocles and Plato, going all the way up through the medieval period, the Enlightenment, into the 20th century, reading people like Dewey and C.S. Lewis and Martin Buber and Martin Luther King, and disagreeing civilly, thoughtfully, but really disagreeing and laying before our students the very best that we are able to come up with for our respective points of view, and actually often reversing roles and playing devil's advocate. But this goes to the question of viewpoint diversity, and especially representation among the grown-ups, the people with the PhDs and who have teaching responsibility in classrooms. I have always prided myself on being a teacher who does represent, with the best possible arguments, points of view that I myself disagree with. I teach all the hot button questions. You name it, affirmative action, abortion, marriage, euthanasia, capital punishment, you name it, and I teach it in my constitutional law and civil liberties and philosophy of law and moral and political philosophy courses. And I do pride myself on being the sort of guy who, although I have strong views of my own on all of those topics, I do a good job. I'm fair about explaining and defending the other point of view. Last year, one of the two winners of Princeton's Pine Prize, a wonderful young woman named Solveig Gold. The Pine Prize is the top prize, the prize for the top 2 students at Princeton. And Solveig, in her acceptance speech, mentioned that one of her best experiences at Princeton was listening to Professor George eviscerate a conservative argument in the civil liberties class she attended. And I felt proud that students notice that I do that. But you know what? Teaching with Cornell has shown me that I'm not nearly as good at it as I thought I was. And that it really, really does help to have people around who believe it and aren't just representing it in as sympathetic a way as possible. I'll tell you how I know this. Because when we're talking about stuff in class together, deep issues, probing things, and sometimes when it even gets a little intense, I'll notice Cornell making an argument, a good one, for his view that never would have dawned on me and is making me think. And guess what? Cornell tells me that he has exactly the same experience. He too has always prided himself and is praised by our students at Princeton, deservedly, as someone who does try to represent conservative points of view in his class in a sympathetic and accurate way. He's terrific. And yet he says his experience teaching with me is the same as mine teaching with him, that sometimes I'll say things, I'll come up with arguments that simply weren't in his field of vision, but represent significant challenges. So I think there is absolute, but to have that happen on a college campus, whether it's jointly two guys in a classroom together, or more broadly, so that students can take classes from somebody with this point of view, say Peter Singer's point of view, and somebody from another point of view, say my point of view, or Leon Cass's point of view. For that to happen, not only do you need people on the left, of which we have some, you need some people in the right. On the right. That magic in the classroom with Cornell can only happen because there happens to be some guy who disagrees with him, very fundamentally, and is willing to defend positions that are very much minority positions on campus, and positions that can, in our current milieu, get you in some trouble for expressing. I've taken up more time than I was allotted, and I want to thank you, and I want to thank my fellow panelists for listening. Thank you.
I guess I'll go up here. I don't have to because I have this mic. Well, hello, I'm Alison Stanger, and I guess I just want to begin by echoing some of Robbie's words of praise for the fine things that are going on at Arizona State University, and just wanted to add something to Paul's kind introduction that, doesn't need to be stated, but we might as well state it, that I love Hillary Clinton. I worked for Hillary Clinton. I didn't want to lock her up, and And I just want to say in that light that I completely agree 100% with Robbie George's educational philosophy. What he's described as what goes on in his classroom is what goes on in my classroom at Middlebury. And I couldn't agree more with everything he said about entertaining alternative viewpoints and actually having people who believe them present them, being an important part of the educational experience. I think a big part of the reason why I agreed to moderate the discussion with Charles Murray at Middlebury College is precisely because I'm a product of Harvard University's Department of Government, and one of my favorite professors was Harvey Mansfield. I was in all his courses precisely because he would get me so angry that I'd be angry for like 2 weeks, and then I'd really stop and think about what he'd said, and it really helped me grow as a human being and a thinker. So I just wanted to start off by saying this. I think what I want to do here today is I've been on the road a lot. Can you hear me okay? Is the microphone interacting? Are you okay? Okay. I've been on the road a lot in the past 5 weeks. I spent a stint at ASU. I had a wonderful time at a workshop that Robbie and Steve Macedo organized at Princeton that really pushed my thinking forward on these issues. And I thought what I might do is perhaps come at these issues by arguing with what might be a conservative argument. That is that we really need more viewpoint diversity in our colleges, because let's face it, the overwhelming majority of college professors are Democrats. That's just fact. But I would submit to you this, that I don't think the academy is tilting leftward. I think the academy is in some instances defining community in opposition to what Robbie has called truth-seeking or the life of the mind. And I think this is no trivial reorientation, because nothing less than free inquiry and the civil discourse upon which American constitutional democracy depend is at stake here. So this is no small issue. What I might say, and you might disagree with this, I don't know, is what I'm coming to realize is I don't think we have a First Amendment crisis on our campuses. Just toss that out there to be provocative, because we've heard that argument made. I think what we're really having is a debate over the purpose of higher education and the very mission of the university, which I would agree with Robbie is both higher education and knowledge production or knowledge transmission. So in a sense, there's been this is something that took place at Middlebury. There was this false dichotomy that emerged in the debates following the Charles Murray incident, that you have freedom of speech on the one hand, there's these mean conservatives clubbing people over the head with their freedom of speech, and inclusivity on the other hand. Rather than realizing that setting the ground rules for free expression, setting the ground rules for the life of the mind, is the very point of departure through which you will get greater inclusivity, naturally, without quotas, without mandating it from on high. So I think when we talk about disinviting or shutting down speakers on college campuses, especially when faculty deem them worthy of engaging, that's really a violation of academic freedom. That's not a freedom of speech issue. That's a violation of what the university should be promoting. And there I would make a distinction between someone like Charles Murray on the one hand and someone like Richard Spencer on the other hand. In the instance of Charles Murray, what was interesting about him is a student club had invited him in, official student club, so it was completely above board for him to be invited. And then they asked me, precisely because they know I disagree with him, to moderate the discussion. And they wanted it to be they realized he was controversial, so they said, can you please ask the first 3 or 4 questions? And I took this role very seriously. I read everything. I did my homework. I had these killer questions. He was just going to go down. And I never really got the chance to ask them in the way I wanted to. We did do this kind of Radio Free Middlebury thing where people said, oh, you did get to speak. He did get to speak, some people said, and you did get to ask your questions. But trust me, if you ever watch that videotape, I am much better when people aren't pulling fire alarms and threatening to break through the window. I may have had a calm demeanor there, but I was not at my intellectual best in that setting. So I'd encourage you to hear me elsewhere, is what I would say. The second point I wanted to make, in addition to this idea that disinviting or shutting down speakers that faculty have deemed worth engaging is a violation of academic freedom, is that I think groupthink, that is people mindless repeating what other people are saying without thinking for themselves or reading material for themselves, is the antithesis of liberal education. The most disturbing thing to me, looking back on it in hindsight, about what happened at Middlebury is not that I was injured or there was a mob or that all these horrible things transpired. It really is this vision, this spectacle in my mind that I can't shake of students and faculty saying out loud, and you can verify this for yourself because they said it to the media with complete lack of shame, that I have not read a single thing Charles Murray has written, but I know he shouldn't speak on campus. That to me is the antithesis of liberal education. We have to think for ourselves, and at the very least, hear the speaker out, or read something that he's actually written before deciding not to attend. And that did not happen at Middlebury. This is something very important here, because it's not just about education, which I think is the foundation for building citizens for American democracy. It's also about human decency and empathy, because when people stop thinking for themselves, across the board in any human situation, it is far easier to treat other human beings as a means to an alleged higher end rather than as ends in themselves. I really see this direct connection between the absence of empathy and people failing to think for themselves. Think about the most horrific political situations you can imagine. Think about Nazi Germany. Think about, not that what's going on our college campuses today has anything to do with Nazi Germany. We live in a great country where even though we have these problems, they're nothing compared to what's going on in some other countries. But I think you can really see that you get the banality of evil in some sense consists in people stopping to think for themselves. And they start just repeating what somebody said. And just because somebody else said it, it must be true. That's 1938 Germany. Think about what they were saying about the Jews in Germany in 1938. I can't stress this enough, that groupthink is the antithesis of liberal education, and in some sense it is at odds with American values and American democracy. Third, I would agree with Robbie that truth-seeking or the cultivation of the mind is at odds with what I would call tribalism in all its manifestations. Tribalism can take many forms. I don't need to go into it here. I think it can take methodological forms in the academy where people are wedded to a particular methodology, so they don't want to hear things that would challenge that methodology. It can be, in addition to being methodological, it can be ideological. People have a set list of what they believe, and if anybody challenges that, they're going to go and search for the alternative fact that will vindicate their position rather than perhaps contemplating that maybe they might be wrong. You can have tribalism as well. That's racial, obviously. It can be both white and black. But I think truth-seeking is an antidote to this. If you put that first and foremost, the free exchange of ideas, actually listening to what other people have to say, actually proceeding in good faith and entertaining the possibility that, you know what, you might know a lot, but you could, in some rare instances, be wrong. That, to me, is so extraordinarily important, not just for our universities, not just for American democracy, but really just for nearly every realm of human endeavor. Think about it. The existence of truth, the idea that there might be some truth that we could work toward asymptotically or otherwise, that's really central to the proper functioning of nearly every human endeavor. So if we want to throw out truth, we're in big trouble on all sorts of scores. The fourth point I'd like to make is it's a topic of a new research project I'm starting that I got to test drive at the Santa Fe Institute this month. And that's the importance of free thinking and the free thinking individual in a big data world, which is the world we presently inhabit. In other words, there are companies out there that want to reduce human beings to algorithms. Not to sound melodramatic, but this is simply true. If you look at the work of Cambridge Analytica in both the 2016 presidential elections, but also in Brexit, you see a very subtle, sophisticated attempt to use social media and data mining to figure out people's emotional buttons. And once you know what those buttons are, you can manipulate them to vote the way you want. Well, I don't need to tell you here that human beings are not algorithms. And the fact of the matter is you cannot be an algorithm unless you allow yourself to be reduced to an algorithm. So to me, it's extraordinarily important to think, to have freedom of expression, freedom of thought in this big data world, because you see things like predictive criminality. You see all these efforts to reduce the individual to a set of patterns. You know what my biggest complaint with the bell curve is? I don't care about bell curves. I care about the individual. In other words, you can tell me there are all these patterns about men, women, races, and the data might be true. But to me, that doesn't matter, because we can't say anything about an individual based on those external attributes. And if we don't drive that home in a big data world, our democracy and our educational processes are in serious trouble. So what can we do about this? What's to be done? All of this leads me to believe that calls from the right for viewpoint diversity will not address the problem, because they simply further politicize a realm that should make every effort to transcend politics and give every scholarly argument its proper due, regardless of its origins and regardless of what majority opinion might be. Now, that's not to say that we might step back and look at this supreme imbalance in terms of political affiliation on our faculty, particularly in political science departments, and find it very appealing to hire more conservatives, for the simple reason I've already talked about the importance of the free exchange of ideas and how you really can get that dynamic give and take in a much more profound way if you have people who actually believe the things they're saying, as opposed to constructing arguments for the other side. But I would just be against quotas of any sort, and I think trying to right the problem that way is not going to get us where we need to go. Or put another way, balancing left and right, which is a political agenda, is of lesser importance than allowing reason and logic to reign supreme. So I would say that in all endeavors we should strive to encourage our students. We can model the behavior we want to see. We talked about this at Princeton. We should try to encourage our students to harness emotion, the very real emotions they're feeling, in service of reasoned truth seeking. And I think this is important on both left and right, where you see this disturbing tendency both in the university and in our politics, that you look at the other side and you think, they're evil. They're so awful. We would be stupid not to fight fire with fire. They're going to use those tactics. We're going to use those tactics. And this is a very dangerous trend, because this is a recipe for extremism. Those fight fire with fire tactics really only fan the flames of extremism, both in the polis and in the ivory tower. Why is extremism a problem? I know Barry Gold